Hey, what's up guys? It's Reid Young, aka Shoot for TransformPoker.com, and today I'm going to do something a little bit special for you guys and play some real money poker here. I've put some money onto a non-regulated United States site like a retard, so here we go, just for you guys. I'm going to be trying to run up this piddly amount of money to something significant in a small amount of time by playing well above what my bankroll's requirements are. So we're starting off pretty well though. Actually, I get aces, so I raised and got 3 callers. And continuation bet, I decided to go like 14 into a 23 here for a few reasons. Firstly, multi-way, I expect someone to connect with this board a lot of the time. So if I do want to bet a wide range, it's nice to have some of the middle strength hands that might fold. Say the button might get away from pocket fives if I bet larger here because he's worried about the other 2 players overcalling with a stronger hand. You know, maybe fives are a bit too weak. Something like sevens, he might even try to like hero fold here, multi-way. But if I bet 14, it might coax him to come along, and especially because there is the button shorter stack here, I want to bet 14 and give him the illusion of having some folding equity. So I think that's a pretty good size overall for a few reasons. And actually I get jammed on by the button, so you know, 0 thoughts of folding here for sure. And the good thing about being able to bet call or bet 3-bet and overpair in this type of situation is that people do jam draws on you, and I'm sure some of it's because you're shorter stacked, but a lot of people will raise the flop and then jam over a 3-bet with a flush draw, which isn't necessarily a bad play. Because you have a lot of equity when you are called, and it's tough to have 2-pair or a set on this type of board texture. So an ace-high flush draw is about the best you can do. But if you have a hand like aces or you know, a bottom set in your 3-bet calling range, then you have a lot better equity on average than your opponent thinks you're going to when they go all in with the flush. So that's just a quick example of how constructing your 3-betting range can help you out when you do get all in. So obviously having aces, not too difficult to play there though. So I've actually just waiting for some action on the left hand side here. It's a heads up table, so I think things will be getting pretty fast paced here pretty soon if I can get someone. Oh, here we go. Alright, I do the old switch seat move here. Just prefer being on the bottom, power bottom. I'm just checking out my note here on this small blind guy. He's not full stacked, so I'm a little bit worried that he's fishy, and if I 3-bet him pre-flop, he's going to be calling, and then with a smaller stack to pot ratio, that I'm not going to be able to exploit him folding so many hands post-flop, because if he does have a piece, he's just much more likely to come along if I'm only able to bet the flop and then move all in on the turn. Also, with a hand as weak as 10-6 suited, about the best draw I can have to do that with is going to be a gut shot most of the time. And unless I hit 2-pair or like a bottom pair with 6s, my semi-bluff is not going to have a lot of equity when called. So that's going to prevent me from bluffing as frequently as I'd like. So I just elect to take a flop. I'm in position. I'm getting 3-1 pre-flop. So I'm pretty much just not going to be folding against a player who seems to be weak. I mean, he's not buying in full stacked, and I already have a note on him that he's kind of playing oddly. I don't know what the specifics of that hand are, but I just remember it was bad, and then I probably didn't take as good of a note as I would like to. On the flop, this is a board texture he's probably continuation betting about all the time, and actually the nice thing about a lot of these like weaker players is that they continuation bet hands like ace-3 here, but they never check and call it. So if they check, they always have a medium strength hand. But the nice thing about that, as far as raising this flop goes, is that I know his range is a bit more polarized. So it's much more likely he has something like queen-10 offsuit here than a hand like pocket jacks or like king-8 that he might be bet calling and then check folding on the turn. So I think in general, raising once and then shutting down against a lot of weaker players is good, unless it's a draw heavy board texture like this one, where you can anticipate the player check folding a lot of draws on the turn. And that's kind of what happens here. I also pick up another gutter, so I have a double gutter. I can hit a 5 or a 9, and that's certainly some of the reason I'm betting again. And I bet large enough that I can potentially threaten stacks by the river, which I think is important, especially against a weaker player. And in general, so you can realize the full value of, your value betting range. That's really the point of bluffing, though, is just to put your opponent's made hands into a tough decision for the times that you are value betting. So a lot of people kind of over romanticize bluffing, I think, and say like, oh, well, is he going to fold? Is he not going to fold? Like, I don't think that's the main point of bluffing. The main point of bluffing is to get called more often. So against a weaker player, we can play exploitively in a lot of spots just because they're going to be making incorrect folds because they make a lot of mistakes otherwise. So here I make it 5 because the big blind's a little bit shorter, and also because I like being able to bet call, or I guess raise call hands like this pre-flop. And if I made it 6 and he makes it something like 18 or 20, it's a little bit out of reach, I think, especially like readless. But if I make it 5 and he makes it 15, I'm already getting great odds, and I have position with a very playable hand. I don't expect to be dominated very often, so my one pair hands are pretty easy to play, I think, in position. A lot of the time you can see the river with a hand of that strength. And then on the left-hand side, yeah, a very similar concept. This might be a little bit of a loose call, but I don't think so. I mean, I'm getting pretty good odds on position here. And heads up, it's tough to really fold anything that's reasonable. I completely whiff the flop on the left, and I think a flop raise doesn't represent all that much. Even though you might just bet fold stuff like king queen anyway, I really don't want to be just bluff raising the flop 100% of the time without any reads on this opponent, and especially when I'm not really representing that many hands. Sure, I might have like 10-6 suited or 10-5 suited, but that's pretty presumptuous. So I'm really representing like ace-10-ish. That's kind of raise calling for some reason. It doesn't make sense. Because if he 3-bets all in, I would expect his value range to crush me. It'd be like basically perfect, jacks plus. And then I think he probably wouldn't anticipate me bluffing too much there, just because it is such an awkward board texture. So I'm not really sure that I would force him to make too many mistakes if I raise queen 8. With the 10-8 suited hand, I flop very well. I flop an open-ended straight draw, and I have 2 overcards to middle pair, which isn't extremely significant in a re-raise pot, because I don't expect him to have a ton of like ace-7 combinations or anything like that. But I'm definitely calling his flop continuation bet, and kind of with the idea of actually this exact thing happening. So it's nice that we kind of get to see this happen. I call the flop. You could raise it and move all in over a 3-bet, but there's kind of drawbacks to that. He bet fairly largely on the flop, which I think is fine. It's a board that's not likely to help either of our ranges that much, so he can just continue to exploit the fact that he should have all the hands like 10s and higher pre-flop, where I probably would not have those hands very often. So the best I can do really is to have a draw or like trip 9s or a pair of 7s on this board, and none of that is great except for the 9s, but those are pretty few and far between. I have to make a decently loose call pre-flop and then also make trips, so that's kind of a few unlikely things that have to happen at the same time. On this turn, I expect him, and a lot of turns, kind of extrapolating from the flop dynamic, I expect him to bet again, and probably too widely here, because on the flop he's thinking like, oh, well, I can go ahead and just get him to fold queen jack offsuit, so I'm going to go ahead and continuation bet my 5-4 of hearts. Then on this turn he's like, well, I always have king queen and ace king here because I'm probably always continuation betting the flop with those hands, but he's never going to have those types of hands, so I'm going to go ahead and bluff this turn. And when he does that, I'm planning on moving all in, and that's just to get him to fold some like slightly better draws, maybe something like ace-2 of hearts if he just randomly is bluffing with that. But more importantly, I think, is if I call again, I don't expect him to give me the opportunity to bluff the river a lot of the time. I think he's going to 3-barrel all in, and then I'm you know, it's pretty tough to hero call someone with 10 high. I think he'd be bluffing with far too many better hands. On this flop, I get min led into, and I think it's just nice to go ahead and set a precedent with the 3-9 that I'm not going to be just trying to see a showdown, like if he's going to bet like 1/3 pot into me 3 times or something like that. I really want to apply some pressure early and make sure I'm the one forcing the action and not let him do these like cheap leads that get me out of my comfort zone. So I'm going to be raising here, even though my hand is pretty crappy. And then he ends up calling, so I expect most of the time to be behind him unless he's making some odd out of position float, which, I mean, I would essentially treat this like a check call. It's essentially the same thing, just a little bit more money went into the pot, and I think that's a nice way to simplify these spots against weaker players. So another thing, 3-9 offsuit is obviously pretty loose preflop, but I'm going to be raising about 100% of my buttons unless someone is giving me a reason not to, but really that reason would have to be pretty incredible. I don't know, I couldn't name one almost.